Hello, and welcome to the Servant Leadership Today podcast. My name is Sam Shint, and I'm joined by Rick Kite. Each episode, we talk with leaders in a variety of fields about character, the common good, and the importance of civic virtue. Hi, Rick. How you doing today?
Doing well, Sam. It's fall, and it feels like fall, finally.
It certainly does. It has certainly been brisk the last couple of days. And in terms of fall, I understand also you were up north last week and you got your deer for the season.
Yeah, every year I think it's not going to happen, and I seem to wait till the last minute. But one walked out in front of my stand on my last day hunting up there. So our freezer, which was pretty much empty, is now full of venison again.
Oh, wonderful. Well, congratulations. And what a nice thing for that deer to do, to just walk right in front of your stand and make it very convenient for you that day.
It's a sacred moment
Absolutely.
Spending all that time. And this is what Thoreau says also. It works with hunting, and it also works with contemplation. You sit in one place and all the creatures of the woods reveal themselves to you. And that's kind of how it feels.
Oh, that is wonderful. Well, I'm so glad that you were able to do that, and I'm glad that you were able to impart that meaning as well. Well, today's guest is Sara Eskrich. Sara is the executive director of Democracy Found, a Wisconsin-based nonpartisan initiative committed to revitalizing democracy. By implementing a system of FinalFive voting, a system wherein the top 5 candidates are selected from the primary ballot and instant runoff voting is used in the general election, they will ensure that politicians are held accountable for delivering results. Sara previously served on the Madison Common Council and currently serves as a Madison Metropolitan Sewerage District Commissioner. She is a member of the Madison Downtown Rotary and the Hone Group. Her career includes roles in the public and private sectors, including at Deloitte Consulting, the UW Population Health Institute, Kids Forward, the Wisconsin Alliance for Women's Health, and City Council President Michael P. Ross's campaign and office at the City of Boston. Sara is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison and holds a Master's of Public Affairs from the Robert M. La Follette School and Master's of Public Health from the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. Welcome, Sara Eskrich. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Sam. Thanks so much for having me. I'm pleased to be with you all on this chilly Wisconsin day.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it is great to see you. You and I have talked several times over the past year about this FinalFive voting program, of which you and your group are the leading proponents of making this change. So for the benefit of the listeners who may not be familiar with FinalFive voting, why don't you tell us a little bit about what this is?
Sure, I appreciate the opportunity, because FinalFive is a new thing in some ways, and it's also a combination of things that have been used for a long time when it comes to voting in our country and in other countries. So FinalFive is an innovative combination of 2 changes, one in the primary election and one in the general election. The first is to get rid of party primaries. So no longer when you go in to vote do you have to choose whether you're going to vote in the Democratic column or the Republican column. You pick your favorite candidate regardless of their party affiliation. And that allows for the top 5 finishers out of that single ballot primary to advance to the general election, meaning the general election is now the election that matters, and voters have a real set of meaningful choices on that general election ballot. So to manage that competition of 5 candidates in a general election, we use an instant runoff process to calculate results. So a ranked choice ballot allows voters to select their favorite candidate. And if they want to, they can also say that if they can't have that candidate, who they like second, third, fourth, and fifth. They can rank as many or as few choices as they choose. And then the ballots are tabulated in such a way that all first place votes are counted first. If someone gets a majority, over 50% of support, that candidate wins. But if no one gets a majority of first place votes alone, you go through this series of instantaneous runoffs and calculation processes accordingly. So what that does, what that effectively means in practice, is that through a system of FinalFive voting, we as voters get the benefit of more choice on our ballot, but also that's ultimately the candidate who gets elected has the broadest support amongst the electorate. So it allows for a degree of accountability and representativeness and results-oriented governing that our current system of very low turnout partisan primaries really inhibits when it comes to the governing process, which I'm sure we'll get into more in our conversation today. But suffice to say, FinalFive voting, those two changes, the top single ballot top 5 primary and an instant runoff general election. We're advocating for those combined for federal elections here in Wisconsin.
Excellent. And so you mentioned that this is not necessarily a new idea, that some states and maybe counties or cities are already using this process. How is that going at this point?
Yeah, we call it an innovation because it's really a combination of two different reforms that have been implemented in various states and localities. So you may be familiar with the state of California, Washington state. They use a top 2 primary system. So they've opened up their primary to some degree to 2 candidates. And then various municipalities all across the country and over a dozen states at this point use ranked choice voting, that instant runoff process for their municipal elections. So localities use that system to elect their local government officials. And then the state of Maine has implemented ranked choice voting for their statewide and some local elections, as well as their federal elections in the state of Maine. So the only place that has passed this combined change of putting that open primary system together with an instant runoff system is the state of Alaska. They passed it via ballot initiative in 2020. So they will use this new election system for the first time in 2022. But you asked how it's going, Sam, and what we know from results to date is that that system, particularly there's a lot of research around the system of instant runoff voting using a ranked choice ballot. We know that voters very much both appreciate the opportunity to rank their choices and find it easy to do. So they use the ballot, they rank their choices, they report appreciating that opportunity. They like using a system of ranked choice voting and use it meaningfully to affect results when used at that local level.
Have you seen any statistics yet in terms of turnout, or whether this is impacting voter turnout? Because, as we know, one of the reasons people don't like to participate, particularly in, say, primary elections, is the feeling that maybe their vote's not going to count. I don't like the candidate, and I like a secondary or tertiary candidate, so why waste my time and my vote?
Right. Why waste my time and my vote? Because I don't like the candidates, but also because maybe I feel like my vote doesn't matter. And so often in our current system of elections, just to amplify that point, we saw in the 2020 election that effectively 10% of the population elected 86% of our members of Congress. So that feeling that we all have, or so many of us have, that our vote doesn't matter is actually borne out in the data, that in so many of these places, it was very, very few, a very small segment of the electorate whose vote did matter meaningfully in who got elected. So what we've seen in the implementations to date of ranked choice voting in particular, I was actually just looking at a literature review of the various studies on ranked choice voting this morning that just came out from the New America Foundation. They really showed that ranked choice voting alone, at least as far as we can tell from the current implementations, doesn't seemingly impact turnout too much either way. So it doesn't, sometimes opponents will say that it will decrease turnout because it will be too confusing for voters. That doesn't seem to be the case. And then there's the argument that perhaps it will increase turnout because of the facts we just talked about, people not feeling like they have someone they can be excited to vote for. That doesn't seem to be directly correlated, or we can't show causation with ranked choice voting in that. Often turnout is much more a factor of competitive races, having a broad swath of candidates. So you could take that to mean that over time, as you do have more competition in these elections, as we have a top 5 system where there's meaningful candidate competition, particularly for higher information elections like congressional elections, I think you can deduce that is a likely outcome. but in the data to date, we haven't seen it meaningfully as a causation of increased turnout.
And so you mentioned that this is under consideration and you're working hard to get this passed in Wisconsin with respect to the federal elections. First of all, how's that going in terms of that process?
Thanks for asking. It's going very well. I have been frankly floored by the amount of interest that we've gotten from state legislators in this concept of FinalFive voting for federal elections. As we all know, Congress's approval ratings are quite low, seem to stay quite low. So there seems to be bipartisan agreement that what we have is not working. And so that has, I think, meaningfully translated into an interest in what we could do differently to help the system work better. So what we've seen from state legislators across the political spectrum, Republicans, Democrats, ideologically conservatives, moderates, liberals, progressives, is an openness to this concept, is to say, well, maybe we should do elections differently. Maybe it would be meaningfully different to look at a system of FinalFive voting. So to date, we have introduced that legislation by a bipartisan group of co-sponsors. Very, again, meaningfully, the bill was introduced by a Republican and a Democrat in the state Senate and a Republican and a Democrat in the state Assembly. So this idea is nonpartisan, both in the nature of the change itself, but also the impact of the change. It's not going to inadvertently hurt or help one party or another. It is going to help the system as a whole work better and make elected officials more accountable to us as voters. So that has shown up in terms of the support, both inside of the state capitol as to who is supporting the bill, but also in the group of people who are rallying around the concept outside of the state capitol when you talk to regular Wisconsinites about this. And that's what I think is most exciting to me about this concept, especially right now in Wisconsin.
And do we see similar efforts happening in other states?
We do. One of the interesting and exciting things about making change when it comes to elections is as you all know, and many people know, we live in this federalist system where election laws are set at the state level, meaning that's where the change happens, and states have the power to run their elections differently. So they get to decide how they run their federal elections. And about half of the states have binding ballot initiatives, so citizen referendum processes, essentially, to allow change to happen. That's how this system came to the state of Alaska. That's how ranked choice voting came to the state of Maine. In Wisconsin, we don't have a binding citizen referendum or initiative process. So our change has to come through legislative change, through a bill with the state legislature, which is what's been introduced in our state so far. And you will see about half of the other states, as I mentioned, will need to make their change through state legislation as well. So in the coming years, there's just a real growth in support for change in general, but specifically these systemic changes to how we vote to make elections more accountable. So I think you will see both more ballot initiatives in states where that's an option, as well as legislation moving forward for FinalFive voting in the coming years.
So it seems to me another one of the impacts here, and I'm curious as to what you're hearing on this or what you're seeing on this, is the potential that it could break the hold of the two parties on elections. And one of the things I've heard about this notion of FinalFive or ranked choice voting is that it gives an opening, or at least a space, for other parties to come in, or minor parties to come in. What are your thoughts on that? Or are you hearing that or seeing some of that?
Yeah, it's a system that is inherently based on, the theory behind it is one of competition theory, which is to say, in industries, competition is what creates accountability. So having choices for us as customers in this industry of politics, as voters, is good for us, right? This idea that in any other industry, if we don't like our choices, we pick something else. And for some reason, this industry of politics has only given us two choices. And when we look at other choices, whether it be third parties or independents or even non-incumbent politicians of the same party in our electoral process, we are regularly told, oh no, don't go for that option, right? New competition, new choices for you as a voter is going to somehow be bad for you. And that gets back to the system of voting, this plurality electoral system that we currently have. And what that means is, frankly, in our current system, it can, quote unquote, mess with the results when third party or independent candidates get into the race. They become spoilers. They become wasted votes. Is true that if you vote for a third party or an independent candidate, in most cases, you are throwing your vote away, to use the colloquial term, or spoiling the election for the candidate you might like, second best. So we make a pragmatic choice as voters and as candidates to not run as third parties or independent candidates or vote for those candidates in our current system. And that's what an instant runoff system, a ranked choice ballot, would solve for. It allows for choices. It allows for voters to express a preference different than maybe the two-party candidates they would have gotten in our current system, and not waste their vote, and not throw their vote away, and not spoil the election. So they can signify that they may have a different preference, and yet the Democrat or the Republican might be their second choice. And they're able to say, yeah, but that issue over there, that issue matters to me, that person, right, that third party, that independent, that other candidate is advocating for, is something that I care about. So I'm going to vote accordingly, and it won't be a waste. So regardless of the results, right, we've had a lot of data scientists, both Republicans and Democrats, dive through the data to try to figure out, is this somehow going to break the system? Is this system going to somehow advantage one party or the other? And what they found is that it doesn't. And in most places, it doesn't meaningfully change, frankly, who gets elected. You're going to elect a Republican in a red district. You're going to elect a Democrat in a blue district. But that opportunity to have real choice on a ballot as a voter and signify your preference is a meaningful exercise, both in the information that you're putting into the system and then what the candidates have the power to do with that, which is to say, now, as a candidate, I'm accountable to my general electorate because of getting rid of the party primary in this system. And I can negotiate accordingly on solutions in governing, which often requires some sort of coalition building. It requires alliances across the aisle and some nuance in the details and the weeds of policymaking. And a system of FinalFive voting where you're trying to get that broad support from your electorate allows you to have that flexibility in governing. So I think that's one of the powerful things about giving voters choice, making sure that there's actually competition in a general election, is just that simple reality that the general election should be the election that matters the most. And that will actually give some freedom to our elected officials in governing, even if you don't change the outcome, frankly, of who gets elected in a system like FinalFive voting.
Well, and it's interesting, you note that it's not going to necessarily break the stranglehold of red or blue districts. And I mean, that's a whole other separate conversation on gerrymandering for sure. But what I think someone mentioned at one point, and I'm not sure if it was you or someone else, that talked about the fact that what this could do, though, is temper the extremism that happens within that district, because all of a sudden you've got the potential for more voices from a particular party competing for that slot, which could moderate the voices that end up getting elected, which again goes to that whole idea of then representing a broader swath of the people within that district or being more representative.
Yeah, and whether you call it moderation or just simply the ability to problem solve, it's exactly that. It's the fact that if the majority of your district wants you to do something, you should have the freedom in governing to do that as an elected official. And so often these days, on the issues that are frankly the most controversial and the most challenging and the most important for us to solve, think about immigration, economic issues, healthcare, there are things we can do to make our policy better, to make the systems work better. Immigration is such a good example because both sides have had compromise immigration deals that have been killed because effectively a small segment of their base on either side of the aisle has said that that solution is not perfect enough. And because of the nature of how we elect our representatives, they can get taken out in a party primary by that small segment of the electorate on either side. So naturally, that is who they have to be accountable to. And if you solve for that structural problem in where the accountability lies electorally, you're never going to get different results in governing. You're never going to get to the place that the 86% of support for whatever the consensus-oriented solution is to the problem. It's not going to matter if ultimately you can get taken out by that small segment of the primary electorate.
This is a really interesting discussion, and I'm curious listening to you talk about, the kind of support there has been anyway, like in Wisconsin, bipartisan support. Are the legislators who are supporting these changes, do they tend to be more moderate, or are they coming from different kinds of districts where they tend to be more purple districts? Like, why are some politicians supporting this and others are resistant to it? That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, it's a great question, Rick. And one of the things that I do find most powerful about our support base in Wisconsin to date is that it is not simply moderates that are supporting this. It is people from all across the ideological spectrum, from conservative to moderate to very progressive and liberal. So what that means to me is that there is a rationale to support FinalFive voting, regardless of where you fall on the political ideological spectrum. The resistance often comes much more from those who are trained in the current system, as opposed to those who could benefit from change.
Are you speaking like the party leaders are really resistant to it?
Yes, it is much more party leadership that is resistant. And frankly, sometimes we call them the political industrial complex, the people who run elections, the special interests and consultants and people who know how to run elections under the current system, where change is just scary, like it would be in anything. It's the typical issue of making change in any industry. Change is hard because people know what they know and they keep doing it. And so when you shift that to, no, do something differently, that resistance is going to come from people who feel like they have something to lose because they're doing well and they understand the current system.
Well, and we hear stories especially from people when they're first getting elected to Congress, for example, that they discover right away that party loyalty is rewarded above anything else. And if you try to represent all the voters in your district, you might be punished if you don't toe the party line, punished in regard to like committee assignments and things like that. So I guess part of what you're saying is like, this looks like just an electoral change, but it might have more kind of deeper indirect influences in the way that politics is done after the election.
That's the part that's most exciting to me from a results-oriented perspective, Rick, is exactly that if you want to change results, if you want to change the way in which we are getting things done in Washington, D.C., not just who we get elected, I think so often there's something almost alluring about focusing on who we elect, because it's something we hear all the time, right? Elect me and I'll change things. I'll be the change candidate. No, I'll be the change candidate. We go back and forth, and yet like the change candidate never really results in much change, because ultimately the system is what the system is, and they get sent to it and stuck in it, and it processes them through just like everybody else, despite all the best intentions. So I don't think it's worthwhile to blame our politicians for the reality of the incentives that they're stuck with. And the incentives are determined by the method in which they are elected. So it is exactly true that if you want to change the way things are done, you have to change those underlying incentives and accountabilities, and that gets back to the electoral system, and then frees them up to do things differently in governing. One of our one of the great Wisconsinites who's a supporter of this is Congressman Mike Gallagher, who very much tells that story of going to Congress, feeling extremely frustrated by the inability to get anything done once he got there as a freshman, and the fact that your path seemed to be dialing for dollars and working your way up through committee leadership on the one hand, or bomb throwing on Fox News or MSNBC on the other hand, and creating your own social Twitter universe of followers to create a separate channel for fundraising and money, frankly. And there was no path for those who just wanted to get things done and serve their constituents. So that's crazy in a representative republic that we live in. Why should that be the case? And so as much as he wants to change, he's very focused on changes to the way in which Congress operates, leadership structures, committee assignments, the mechanisms of how Congress works. You're not going to change those things until you change the electoral incentives, because there's no incentive for leadership to change them in Congress because they hold the power. So a lot of change gets back to sequencing and timing and what comes first in order to get the ultimate change that you desire and move the needle forward. So I think, what we've seen about where to focus, FinalFive voting is a really important first mover to a lot of other things that might then become possible in our current political system, where so much is gridlocked and things are just not possible when it comes to change.
I found it fascinating watching the Virginia governor's race, where you had what I thought was a Democratic candidate who was really just speaking to the party faithful, right, and a Republican that seemed to be delivering a much more centrist message. And this seems to be a voting system which really appeals much more to the centrists. And I think a lot of centrists, I've been hearing it from a number of people, feel unrepresented at the polls. Right? Is especially in statewide elections, are we going to see a change from the places that use this kind of voting? Are we going to see a change in the way in which candidates campaign, trying to speak across the party lines more?
They have every incentive to do so in a system like this. In a system of FinalFive voting, you have every incentive to campaign differently, because all of a sudden second and third choices matter. So often when you're campaigning in our current system, I'll speak from my own experiences just at the local level, but I ran for the city council, and you get your walk list, and your walk list says these are the people who regularly vote in municipal elections. Only knock the doors of the people who regularly vote in municipal elections. And frankly, if they have a sign out for your opponent, skip their door and keep on walking. Well, that was always challenging for me, because that seems so counter to what we want, which is greater participation in the process, to talk to people, to help them to see that you are a good choice for them. And this system encourages you to go up to that house that might have your opponent's sign in their yard and say, hey, I see that you really like Sam. That's great. Sam is running on things that I think are really important, but I'm Sara Eskrich and I'm running for this office as well. And here's what I stand for. And here's why I think you should rank me second, right? You can still give Sam your first choice if you like him, but make me your second choice. In our current system, I have zero incentive to do that, because if they're going to vote for Sam, doesn't matter if they're not voting for me. It's an either or choice. And so often it's not even a vote for me choice. So many of us, I think, feel like it's a vote against choice. It's a who's the lesser of two evils? Who do you dislike less? So to go back to the place that you started, Rick, which is to say what happened in Virginia, that we had a candidate for governor who was running basically to represent the whole state, and a Democratic governor who seemed to be running for his Democratic base. Well, interestingly, the Republican Party of Virginia decided to use an instant runoff process in their nomination process. So they have a convention nominating process in Virginia, which means that the parties get to decide if they want to run a primary or if they want to use a convention to nominate their candidate. And the Republican convention used a ranked choice ballot and a series of instant runoffs to get to a candidate that broadly reflected their party and became clearly, if you look at the vote totals, the candidate who the state voted for as a whole. So gave them a strong candidate going into that general election, or at least the candidate who had the potential to run a campaign as he did, that focused on the majority of the electorate and getting that full support to win. So I think there is something to say for the fact that if you look at the system itself can help produce candidates who are incentivized to campaign in such a way that they will win with majority support, which is, I would opine, good for our democracy. It's a way in which we have a system that makes it so that people are incentivized to serve us and the public interest, which is ultimately what representative governance is all about.
Well, and I've heard a number of kind of strategists and pundits, reflecting on, if it hadn't been for that runoff primary that the Republican Party used, probably Democrats would have won that election. McAuliffe would have won the election. So this will be really maybe a game changer if parties see this as something that's to their advantage rather than something that weakens them, right?
Absolutely. And the parties, just to add even more to that example, we was just talking to a state legislator here in Wisconsin, a member of the Democratic Party, who reminded me that the Democratic Party in Wisconsin currently uses ranked choice voting to elect their party leadership, so their party chair and other members of their leadership. And the Republican Party, similarly, in their endorsement process, uses a series of runoffs. So happens at convention, so you don't have to use necessarily instant runoff process because you just do it all at once with people at convention. But that same concept, right? Conceptually knowing better to have a broad base of support behind your candidate, behind your leadership, that will be more representative and the right accountability that you want.
I just one final question, and I would say this is like the only thing I've heard as a real strong objection to this is that it's just so darn confusing. And one of the things that we know about for the legitimacy of any style of government, whether it's democracy or something else, it has to be transparent, it has to be understood. And so if people don't understand how candidates are being chosen, it could undermine confidence. Now, I mean, we could say we don't have any further down to go. The confidence is already pretty low, so we might as well try something else. But what do you say about that? The idea that it's just too confusing and it's hard for people to understand.
Yeah. What we know is in all of the data that we have and the uses of, the confusion is usually being used to talk about the ranked choice part of the election, that idea of ranking candidates and going through the instant runoff tabulation. That's usually the part that people think is going to be too confusing. And what we know is that even as recently as this spring, when the biggest ranked choice voting election, the most voters to ever use ranked choice voting, happened in New York City, 95% of voters in New York City said they knew what they were doing, that they understood the process. And 83, I think it was something like 83% of voters meaningfully ranked their choices. And those that didn't rank their choices on that ballot did so knowingly. So they voted for one candidate because they knew that candidate was very likely to win and it wouldn't matter the rest of their rankings. So you can vote for one candidate under this system and your vote still counts, just like it does today. But you have the opportunity, should you so desire, to rank the rest of your choices. Now, if you know that you're voting for the candidate is very likely to win, if you voted for Eric Adams in the mayoral primary in New York City and he won, you voted for him, your vote counted the entire time. So the best response to that is just that's not the experience. Voters do very well under the system. And then the second piece to that, though, I think is important, which is to say, right now, confidence is also low in the election because people don't feel heard through our electoral processes. So this frustration that we're hearing about voting methodology and the way in which people vote, I think is often overshadowing a much greater frustration with the current system, which gets to your point, Rick, about are we kind of as low as we're going to go? Just to say, if we don't fix that problem, they're not going to be satisfied, even with the most secure and transparent electoral process in the world. So that problem, getting at that reason for voter distrust is, I would argue, even more meaningful. And the ways in which FinalFive alleviate and improve voters both trust and meaningful choices, but then also trust in the system because they're getting some results out of it. Again, there's something that is happening. There's an accountability based on there. Is an incredibly meaningful potential result of this should not underestimate when it comes to faith in our democracy.
One of the things you noted in one of your responses earlier was talking about our what we should be expected to have in a republic. And I think folks, tend to forget that we are that special form of democracy, that Republican form of democracy. And of course, one of the cornerstones or the legs of the table, as it were, for Republican democracy is that notion of popular sovereignty. And it seems to me that this really does speak to that whole issue in a way that is transformational. And so, yes, there is the hurdle of trying to learn about it, but the ability for people to actually feel heard and to feel represented is just so enhanced by a system like this that you, again, every time you go to the voting booth, you feel like you have the opportunity to express yourself and for that expression to be part of that conversation, as it were.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sometimes we hear from people, they get excited about something like term limits because they're so frustrated with the system as it currently exists. They're so frustrated with elected officials not delivering. And so their answer is, well, just throw the bums out, right? Get rid of them, have term limits. And ultimately, an accountable electoral system is the mechanism by which our republic was designed to do that, which is to say our vote should be our term limiting ability. If someone is not delivering, our vote should matter. And that's how we take them out if they're not doing their job and representing us and delivering results for us. So I couldn't agree more, Sam, that is a critical potential benefit of this system when it comes to the future of our great American experiment, tasked with designing and experimenting with and making sure all that it should be improving over time.
So where do we stand now in Wisconsin? What are the odds that this will be something that is actually taken up by the state assembly and Senate in the near future as for a vote?
Yeah. So I mentioned it's been introduced. It was just introduced, the legislation, for the first time this session. So earlier in 2021, the legislature introduced the bill. We do expect the bill to get a hearing yet this session, likely in the Senate. So stay tuned for that conversation, but that's what we're working towards when it comes to momentum for this session. There's always the possibility that something could happen and the bill could pass, but I think that's unlikely for this session being the first that it's been introduced and it being still quite a new idea. So much more likely that we continue to reintroduce this bill next session and continue building the support and the awareness in the meantime. So one of the most important things that people can do if you like this concept is to talk about it, to share it, to help build the passionate base of people all across the political spectrum who say, yes, we are incredibly frustrated and things need to change. And hey, here's a way that could happen. Here's something that we have power to change in our state of Wisconsin when it comes to results in Washington, D.C. And there's some momentum behind it. So get involved, and you can learn more on our website, www.democracyfound.org, and forums like this one where we get to talk about the benefits, especially in some of these more long form, detailed conversations, are just so beneficial. So no, I thank you both for engaging in the conversation, because that's how we help people to see that this is something that could be meaningful. Final Five voting could meaningfully change results and incentives for our state.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us about this today. This is a wonderful program that you're wonderful development that you're working on here. And certainly I love the notion that it plays into the continuation of the American experiment. You're speaking to my heart there. So thank you for all of your hard work, and just keep up the good work, and we will keep checking in on progress on this.
Fantastic. Thank you.